Thanks, Matthias, for the introduction. So today I'd like to talk about how users respond when they think their accounts have been attacked. And so the data that I'm going to cover came from a cross-cultural interview study that I conducted with people who had been told that there was a suspicious login incident to their real Facebook accounts. So many of you have probably seen a notification that looks like this one, which says something like, well, recent activity may have affected your account security, and we've secured your account, and you're going to have to do some extra things to get back in, because there may have been a suspicious login to the account. And so I wanted to understand, what is it that people think happened that led up to this particular notification, and what did they do afterward? So as part of the study, participants constructed causal incident timelines where this notification was in the center of the timeline, and they filled out kind of the pre and post behavior of what they did and what they think went on. In this work, I interviewed participants from 5 different countries that I selected based on the fact that they differed in terms of degree of censorship, degree of internet adoption, and various cultural indices like collectivism. So the countries that I studied were Brazil, Germany, India, the United States, and Vietnam. So this work provides us not only with some understanding of how people respond to incidents, but also some understanding of how cultural context may affect people's security interpretation and experiences. Okay, so in order to do this kind of work, I wanted to make sure that users were responding about real incidents that happened to real accounts, and that they were able to talk about those incidents very soon after they occurred. So we didn't have issues of like telescoping bias where people have issues remembering things, or ecological validity problems where if we ask them to imagine a hypothetical incident, they may not be able to interpret that in the same way as a real incident. So I used Facebook log data in order to identify users from these 5 countries who had just been told about a suspicious login incident. And they were contacted immediately after getting that notification. And then they were offered the opportunity to participate in an interview in their native language and in person within 14 days of the incident occurring. I aim to have 15 participants per country and diversified on gender, age, and education in order to get the widest possible set of experiences. And one of the questions that often comes up when doing self-report or interview work is whether people are actually reporting accurately. Not that they necessarily intend to lie, but perhaps they've forgotten things and so forth. And so where I could, I validated their reports with Facebook log data. So if someone said, well, I changed my password on my Facebook account after the incident, I actually went and checked if they had done so. And in 91% of the cases, they had reported accurately. Okay. In order to ensure that there was comparability and validity across all of these different countries in these different languages, I did extensive training with the interview moderators. So I personally piloted 10 interviews in the US in order to develop the interview protocol and this timeline drawing exercise. I then hired an interview training manager who reviewed this protocol with moderators in each of the countries and trained them on the procedure. I then listened in with simultaneous translation to each moderator doing practice interviews and provided iterative feedback to ensure that all of the moderators were giving comparable interviews and that the responses that were coming back from these different participants were comparable. Once I analyzed this data through a traditional qualitative coding process and double coding, I found that there was a common process of incident response across the participants from all of these countries. And I'm going to briefly walk through this process today. But at a high level, a participant will become notified about the incident. They will then begin the process of causal attribution. And that process of causal attribution is influenced both by information they seek out, as well as their kind of general Facebook threat models and past experiences, some of which are affected by their cultural context. Once they've gone through causal attribution, they'll have established a mental model of the incident. The strength of that mental model and what they've come up with then drives whether they decide to take any protective action. And if they do so, they either take a protective action on the platform, so directly on Facebook, or in some cases they take additional protective action off the platform if they think that other accounts may have been compromised. All right, so to start out, they gain incident awareness through the notification. And actually, most participants became aware not through the notification message itself, but through the fact that they had to do a unique secondary authentication process. So for example, sometimes they would have to identify pictures of friends or people who they had recently had comments with, and this sort of unusual thing is what raised their awareness. The secondary authentication task also created a sense of partnership between the users and the platform. So one participant said, well, it made me feel like Facebook is on top of their game and that someone's watching out for me. And the fact that I have to do something as well, that means we're kind of in this together. So they had a positive reaction to this most of the time. Okay, next they begin the process of causal attribution. So participants came up with their own kind of classifications for these incidents. So they either thought it was a false positive. For example, they thought, well, I'm logging in from a new location, that's why I got this. Or perhaps I did some bad behavior. So one participant said, well, I was hacking likes, so I was liking lots and lots and lots of posts, and my friends were liking lots and lots and lots of posts too, and Facebook must have gotten mad about this, and therefore they put me through this checkpoint. Others said, well, it's because I'm on a new device, I mistyped my password, so I got this, or I was using a VPN, and therefore I got these things. And some of these models could be correct, although the incidents I was studying had the highest classifier confidence in being actual incidents, but some of them still may have been false positives. Other participants thought these were true positives. Someone was actually trying to get into the account, and in that case, they either thought it was an unknown attacker, or a known attacker, or they weren't quite sure. And I'll get back to those models in a minute. Finally, some participants thought this was a random security check. So something like what TSA does at the airport, or a checkup to make sure the count was okay, or maybe it's because there's been a lot of fake news issues, so they're going to do this to everyone. These models are not accurate. The notifications never come up as a random check, but a minority of participants thought that was the case. Okay, so there was this causal attribution process, but that wasn't the only thing that led to the final mental model of the incident. People also took into account their general threat models for who they thought broadly, outside of this incident, might want to get into their Facebook accounts. So this is the who and also the what they might do if they got into the account. And there tended to be different models depending on whether it was an unknown or a known attacker. So some of the models that people expressed matched to models in related literature. So Rick Wash has a nice paper in which he describes different attacker models, including the digital graffiti artist, someone who wants to get in and kind of screw around with an account to show that they can. And then the burglar, someone who's trying to get in to steal information for monetary gain. In our work, particularly with the non-Western users, we saw additional models. So the spy, this is a specifically government or state actor who's trying to get into the account in order to find information about someone criticizing the government or doing something wrong. The snoop, someone who's trying to get into the account, they know you, say a friend or a significant other, because they want to know what's going on in your life without asking you. The who else, why would someone who I don't know try to even get into my account? I'm going to close off that possibility. And finally, the humiliator, which is similar to the digital graffiti artist, except this person's trying to get into the account in order to post things specifically for the purpose of humiliating you. And one of the participants who had this model said, well, if someone was trying to get in and they were just going to do funny stuff to prove they could, I'm okay with that, but I'm really not okay if someone's trying to humiliate me. Okay, so these models influenced who people thought was actually attacking in this case. The other thing that had influence was their past experiences. So one participant said, well, the first time that I got the notification, I thought it was someone who was trying to access my Facebook, but after I kept getting this, the next times I realized it was just them trying to enhance security again. Another said, well, the first time I was worried, but now I understand that this happens every time I go to a foreign country, so it doesn't have anything to do with me. And this was true even though for some of these participants, prior incident notification they had gotten had lower classifier confidence, but this isn't actually visible to the users. So prior experiences that seemed to alter people's mental models only had to do with Facebook, No one said, well, I get this a lot on Google, and therefore I don't think it's a big deal here. They seem pretty specific to the platforms. And then these repeated false negatives, if you get them a lot, made people quite likely to disregard the current incident, even if there were different classifier confidences, because as I said, this isn't visible to the users. Okay, so together these create people's mental model. And the vast majority of participants had plausible mental models, but over half of those mental models were weak. So they oscillated between different ones, they weren't very confident when they discussed them, they kept changing their timelines, so on and so forth. And this weakness of mental models has a lot of impact on people's behavior selection. So those who had a true positive mental model, the majority of those users took a protective action. Those who had a false positive mental model, they thought it was because of something they did, very few of them took an action, and those who kept getting repeated notifications didn't take an action. Those who had weak mental models also didn't take an action most of the time, or if they did, they took multiple actions because they weren't quite sure what to do because they weren't really quite sure what had actually happened. Okay, so what did they do when they took an action? 24 participants, so about a third of them actually took an action. And on-platform actions involve doing things like changing your passwords or settings. So for example, enabling two-factor authentication or login alerts. They also involved behaving better. So one participant said, well, I stopped adding strangers to my friend list, and I stopped commenting on strangers' posts. Some of these things may be helpful for security. Some of them may not necessarily directly related to this incident, but we're going to kind of generally behave more compliantly with what we think the platform wants. And finally, participants checked their accounts for tampering. So one said, well, I went into my Messenger account and I checked to see if anything had been sent deceiving other friends. Was someone trying to use the account to spam people? And checking for tampering afterward helped inform future mental models, because if I check whether there was tampering and there wasn't, then I'm more confident if I thought perhaps it could be a false positive. Okay. A minority of participants then took an off-platform action. So they went beyond just changing something on Facebook to change something on another platform. And these behaviors included changing to novel new passwords on other accounts, improving your security posture, so changing some settings on other accounts, and also some potentially insecure changes. So some participants said, well, I think this happened because I mistyped my password, so I'm going to just start saving my passwords in the browser, or maybe I'm going to change my passwords on other accounts to be more similar to my Facebook account so that this doesn't happen to me again. Or perhaps I will start avoiding using a VPN so I don't get put into this checkpoint. So there's this flip side where these notifications, if I think it's because of something I did, can lead me to try to stop doing that thing so this doesn't happen. And finally, some participants made sort of vague efforts toward vigilance. I'm going to be more careful on my email now, too, that this has happened. And when we probe them about what does more careful mean, you get sort of some hand-wavy things about like being more aware of what's going on in the inbox. OK, so there's a number of influences throughout this process from information seeking. I don't have time to cover them here, so I point you to the paper. But one of the interesting findings is that there are different motivations for information seeking, including camaraderie. I want to know other people who have gone through one of these incidents. Finally, we see influence from culture. So how does culture influence this process? We saw influences based on degree of internet censorship, degree of collectivism, and also different uses of Facebook. So those who are in censored countries were more likely to have threat models that focused on government surveillance, and that changed their mental models of what had happened when they got this notification, as well as whether they thought they could defend themselves. So if I think that there is an all-powerful state actor attacking my account, it may seem pointless to try to make changes to, say, my password or other settings. Collectivistic countries, as measured by some of the Hofstede indices, The threat models there tended to focus on known attackers, and there were also different information-seeking behaviors. So those from these countries were more likely to seek out information from people that they knew versus Googling online or going to Facebook help pages. Additionally, they may have different feelings about the incident. So one participant said, well, if really an attacker had got in, I would feel that someone was violating me. And I wouldn't know what to do because I wouldn't be able to do anything to recover. Because the very fact that they got in would be the thing that was a problem, not whatever they did when they were in there. Finally, we saw that those from different countries had different variations in their Facebook usage, and this is true on a quantitative scale as well. And the type of Facebook use influenced both threat models and defenses. So if I'm using my Facebook to run a business, how I want to defend myself, and also who I think is getting in and why is going to look a little bit different than if I only use this to sort of scroll through newsfeed. Interestingly, skill didn't come up. So the main thing we often talk about in cross-cultural work is differences in internet penetration and skill. Now, skill may not have come up, and by not come up, I mean no one said, well, I didn't do a defense because I wasn't sure how to. Very few people were nervous about whether they could do the secondary authentication task. And this is probably the case because to participate in the interviews, you needed to be sufficiently technically savvy to go through like the email scheduling process and so forth. The advantage of skill not coming up is it allowed us to see some of these other nuances which might otherwise be overshadowed by kind of skill or penetration differences. So what does this tell us about moving forward with incident response? So weak mental models make it unlikely that users will take action or that they will take effective action. One of the things that we are not currently doing is we're not doing any causal modeling to try to help people figure out what went on. We have a bunch of signals to tell us, yes, we have X% confidence that this was an incident, but we don't use those signals to try to figure out what happened and make that transparent to help the users figure it out too. Of course, repeated false positives make it hard to regain user attention. We know this from a lot of usable security work on warning messages and so forth. It may be helpful to give some indication of classifier confidence. So if this is a very confident alert versus a not very confident alert, make a UI distinction, because otherwise it looks like the same alert I've gotten 100 times for using a VPN. In the future, we're starting to explore creating structured feedback mechanisms so that users can provide information about their threat models or what they think happened to the classifiers. We can validate this with log data and then begin to train better classification for incidents for individual users. And finally, this work on non-Western cultures supports existing work on marginalized groups like domestic violence victims, for whom known attackers are very important. And defense mechanisms like identifying pictures of friends or people you've recently talked to may not be overly helpful in the case of people that you know. Thank you, and happy to take questions now.
If you have any questions, please come up to the microphone, state your name and affiliation. We don't have time forever.
Tobias Wiebig, TU Delft. I saw that you mostly clustered based on like the high-level cultural dimension, so basically type 1 versus type 2 cultures. Do you think that a further investigation of the individual 6 dimensions of host data might yield further insights?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I think with the sample size here, sometimes it's a little bit hard to go deep just because then we start to wonder, well, is this the individual or is it sort of the culture, right? And we did only specific cities in each of these countries to avoid some of that. These were the largest effects that I could see qualitatively, but I, in the future, would like to do some quantitative work to look at those more carefully. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tina from the Federal Trade Commission. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, in the mental models, people responded by changing their passwords, but did anyone ever think about what they haven't done? I mean, you talked about how there were some false positives, as in people thought that they might be using new devices, but also other things, like maybe people haven't changed their phone number that might be associated with their account. And Facebook uses magic links, so if you click on a link, you're automatically logged in, even if the phone number no longer belongs to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. None of them brought that up. My suspicion is, I think it seemed like there was sort of a reflexive training of like, oh, login, password, had to do different login, change password. It would be interesting to see if we brought that up to them, sort of what the reaction would be. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Elisa. And let's give her another hand of applause.